I'm going to discuss fundamental problems with evidence-based medicine. The focus will be on the recommendation for adult diabetics to take statins. I'm Sam Eggertson. I've been a family doctor since 1979. I'm currently working in a community health center in Washington State. The disclaimer: this presentation is not intended to make specific treatment recommendations. The intent of this video is to present data and to ask questions. Let's begin with a patient. A 74-year-old maintains her diabetes under excellent control with diet and oral medications. She has no history of vascular disease. She does not want to start any new medications. Do you encourage her to take a statin? If you follow our current guideline, the 2013 American Heart Association guideline, and the associated risk calculator, you would put her on a statin of moderate to high intensity. Should we follow this guideline? Is the evidence in support of this guideline credible? John Ioannidis is a professor of epidemiology at Stanford, and his article, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, is the most downloaded study in the history of the Public Library of Science, and he gives a proof that in modern research, the majority of published research claims can be proven false. I'm not going to go through the details of his proof, but this is a free download for those interested. Certainly a disconcerting conclusion. And we have these statements from editors of major journals. Richard Horton is the editor of The Lancet, and Marcia Angel is a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Journals have devolved into information laundering operations for the pharmaceutical industry. They are primarily a marketing machine. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Science has taken a turn towards darkness. There are two fundamental concerns for the evidence of evidence-based medicine. There is publication bias, and there is bias in the studies that are published. First, publication bias. If 10 studies are done on drug X and 2 are positive and 8 are negative, and only the positive studies are published, our supposed evidence-based decisions are being made on a biased sample. Publication bias has been and is a problem. I'm going to give 3 examples of publication bias. These examples are from Ben Goldacre. He is a British physician who presents these examples in his TED Talk YouTube video, What Doctors Don't Know About the Drugs They Prescribe, and in his book, Bad Pharma, How Drug Companies Mislead Doctors and Harm Patients. The first example deals with the antidepressant reboxetine. 7 studies are known to have been completed comparing this antidepressant to placebo. Only one of those 7 studies showed it to be better than placebo, and it was published. The 6 negative trials showing it to be no better than placebo were not published. Studies were published comparing it to other antidepressants and claimed that it was equally effective to other antidepressants, but unpublished studies with 3 times as many patients showed it to be worse. Example 2. If we look at all trials on antidepressants registered with the FDA, 37 of the 38 positive trials were published, but only 3 of the 36 negative trials were published. The third example involves the anti-influenza medication Tamiflu. Roche had done 74 trials on Tamiflu, but held most of them unpublished. In 2009, the Nordic Cochrane Group, not finding any convincing evidence that Tamiflu provided an important benefit, requested that Roche make all the data available. Roche resisted, but after 4 years of bad press and threats of legal action, did begin releasing the data in 2013. When the Cochrane Group was able to review this data, they found serious problems, high risk of bias, missing data, and they questioned the very use of Tamiflu in clinical practice as an anti-influenza drug. It is disconcerting to think that when we prescribe Tamiflu for someone with influenza, we may be giving our patient an expense and the risk of adverse events without an important benefit. So publication bias is very real, but an even greater problem may be bias in the trials that are published. I'm going to give a list of red flags for potential bias in research articles. Most of these will become clear as we use them, but I want to comment on several. Number 5, the study endpoint is a composite which includes soft endpoints combined with hard endpoints to give the impression of significance to those hard endpoints. We will see this repeatedly. Number 6, the relative risk is emphasized and the absolute risk is downplayed. If 2 in 1,000 suffer from disease X, and with treatment now only 1 in 1,000 suffer from X, this is a 50% relative risk reduction, which sounds far more impressive than a 1 in 1,000 absolute risk reduction. Emphasis on the relative risk and downplaying of the absolute risk is evidence that the authors have biases. Let's look at 11 because this one may surprise you. You may react to early termination of a study as indicating it must mean that drug is particularly effective or they would not be able to end the study early. Unfortunately, early termination of a study has become the rule rather than the exception in pharmaceutical company-sponsored trials. Early termination of a study has a number of advantages for the pharmaceutical company. It gives that impression of great effectiveness of the drug. It allows for the use of the study to promote their drug earlier than would otherwise be possible. It saves a great deal of money, and it avoids the risk that subsequent data will be more negative than the initial data, that more adverse events may appear. This is my own sign. I call it the red flashing light sign for potential bias. I give a study the red flashing light if this constellation of red flags are present. The study sponsor has a financial stake in the outcome. The sponsor controls the data prior to providing the data to the study statisticians, and the study is terminated early based on a composite with soft endpoints. I think it's worth spending a moment on this question. Is mortality the only hard endpoint? Death is certain, but the cause of death often is not. Mortality statistics on the cause of death are unreliable. Sudden death, which is most often signed off on the death certificate as due to coronary artery disease, could be found to be due to coronary arteries in this series only a third of the time. A third were from other identifiable medical diseases such as ruptured cerebral aneurysm or pulmonary embolus, and a third simply remained unknown. So it may introduce an error rate if one attributes sudden death to coronary artery disease without confirmation. Other studies have shown a significant error rate between the clinically determined cause of death compared to the autopsy determined cause of death. Most mortality statistics are based on the clinically determined cause of death. In conclusion, it is reasonable to pay particular attention to mortality as a hard endpoint. We're going to go through 3 example studies before turning our focus to diabetes. We'll use these studies to become accustomed to using our red flags. The LRC, this is historically a very important study. It was considered the final proof of the lipid hypothesis. We will see if we agree with that assessment. The Jupiter study is one of the studies used to justify treatment of everyone at risk regardless of cholesterol levels. And the Fourier study I've included because it is a recent study from this year. It is of one of the new PCSK9 inhibitors that markedly lower cholesterol levels. The LRC, the Lipid Research Clinic's Coronary Primary Prevention Trial. On the NIH website, you can find the statement. In January 1984, the LRC provided the long-sought definitive evidence that lowering high blood cholesterol reduces the risk for coronary heart disease. This was a very important study in starting us down the cholesterol road that we continue to be on. Again, we will see if we agree with this assessment. It was published in 2 articles in the same issue of JAMA in 1984. Almost 4,000 men with cholesterol levels in the upper 1% for the population. Red flags. The relative risk is emphasized over the absolute risk, making insignificant differences appear larger. The relative risk reduction in this study was 19%, and the absolute risk reduction was 1.6%, and that was for a composite, not mortality. Soft endpoints were used. You might think that non-fatal MI is not a soft endpoint, but here, non-fatal MI included those with cardiac pain, and we all know how difficult that determination can be, and those with equivocal enzymes and equivocal EKG. The only hard endpoint here, all-cause mortality, was not different. And this is a huge problem with this study. This is a disqualifying problem. They changed the rules of the game after the game was completed. The definition of significance was changed after the data were accumulated. The pretrial protocol called for a level of certainty of p less than 0.01, but they didn't come close. If one applies the standard two-tail criteria of p less than 0.05, they still did not achieve statistical significance. They resorted to a one-tailed test to call the results statistically significant. This was harshly criticized at the time and considered by some to be flagrantly dishonest, but those criticisms were ignored and forgotten, and we have, with this study, the final proof of the lipid hypothesis. Misleading claims were made. The claim that those with coronary heart disease were excluded is false, as the study included men with positive stress tests. Finally, the study of 1% of the male population was extrapolated as to having meaning to the entire population. One can argue that this is not the final proof of the lipid hypothesis, but a deceptive presentation of insignificant results. The Jupiter trial, almost 18,000 men and women with reasonable LDL levels, but with elevated CRP, with an elevated marker for inflammation. Crestor versus placebo, planned for 5 years, but stopped at 19 months due to unequivocal evidence of benefit. Significantly reduces cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. Very impressive statements in the press releases when the study was completed. Red flags. AstraZeneca has a commercial interest in the outcome. Manage the raw data before it's transmitted to the statisticians. Here, the lead investigator was a partial owner on the patent of the CRP test used, and the majority of authors had financial ties to AstraZeneca. Members of the Data Safety Monitoring Board that ended the study early had ties to the pharmaceutical industry. The chairman was an investigator of the Clinical Trial Service Unit of Oxford University, the CTSU. I want you to remember CTSU. We will see this several times as we go through studies, and we will come back to it in more detail later. Further red flags. Soft and hard endpoints were lumped together. When the non-fatal events were removed, the differences were not statistically significant. The data was not consistent with the disease being studied. The mortality rate in the placebo group was far below what would be expected. It was only 8.8% in the placebo group and 29% in the treatment group, and there was no explanation noted for this low sudden cardiac death in the study population. MI mortality should be higher than 8.8% due to the contribution of sudden death to MI mortality. Results for patients with an elevated CRP, and these were women 60 plus and men 50 plus, were extrapolated as to having meaning to the entire population. And although the study was stopped early with claims of unequivocal reduction in cardiovascular mortality, there was no difference in cardiovascular mortality. This one gets the red flashing light. In addition, AstraZeneca owns the data and has not been fully forthcoming with the full data sets produced in this study. The Fourier study. This was a study of more than 27,000 patients with vascular disease, planned for 4 years, stopped early for a significant reduction in risk of a composite endpoint. They concluded that patients with vascular disease benefit from lowering cholesterol levels below current targets. Red flags. A composite endpoint was used to claim benefit, but there was actually higher mortality in the treated group and more cardiovascular deaths in the treated group. Their claim was that this increased mortality was not statistically significant, but when combined with soft endpoints, that the total composite was statistically significant in favor of treatment. Very concerning mortality rates. The investigators clearly had major conflicts of interest. 3 were employees of Amgen. Red flag. Once again, we see the CTSU appear. Members of the Data Safety Monitoring Board that ended this study early had ties to the pharmaceutical industry, just as in the Jupiter trial. The chair received speakers' fees from AstraZeneca, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and Pfizer, and had other ties to the pharmaceutical industry. He, too, had spent time in the CTSU. So we'll come back to the CTSU later. This one gets the red flashing light. Amgen has a financial stake in the outcome, managed the data, and ended the study early on a composite outcome, not mortality. It is interesting to note that Pfizer, after considerable investment on their own PCSK9 inhibitor, abandoned the project. Now, there have been many trials completed since the LRC, and you will find multiple red flags and red flashing lights within those trials. This is some of the alphabet soup of acronyms for cholesterol studies. Some of these we will go through as we go through the data for diabetes. So if we set aside questions about the benefits or lack of benefits for statins for non-diabetics, what about diabetes? Should all adult diabetics be treated with a statin? Back to our patient. She does not want to start a statin. How good is the evidence that she will benefit from a statin? If she doesn't start a statin, you will receive mailed alerts. This is an alert that notes that prescription claims indicate that this patient may have diabetes, but there are no prescription claims for a statin. They give you the American Heart Association guidelines. The implication of this alert is you're not doing your job as a provider by not having this patient on a statin. Before the alerts that referred to the American Heart Association guidelines, the alerts would refer to the American Diabetes Association position statement of 2012. When I received these alerts, I looked at all of the studies cited having to do with diabetics without heart disease and statins. I looked at all the studies cited for both of these alerts, and we are going to go through them now. The first study is the ASPEN study. This is cited by the American Diabetes Association position statement, but left out by the American Heart Association guideline. Robert Knopp was a professor of medicine at the University of Washington stationed at Harborview, and he did a study with 2,400 patients, many with vascular disease, most without, and he did not find a benefit for statins. So certainly the first study we come through does not give us an indication that we should place our patient on a statin. This one had red flags, but the bottom line is there was no overall benefit from statins for diabetics. We next come to the cholesterol treatment trialists meta-analysis of 2008, the CTT 2008. And this meta-analysis includes all of the studies cited by the American Heart Association guideline to support the recommendation to put our patient on a statin. This was a meta-analysis of 14 studies, more than 18,000 patients, and they came to a very strong statement that about 1 in 25 patients with diabetes would be spared a vascular event over the course of 5 years if placed on a statin. I think if you are someone who is impressed with the idea of a meta-analysis and tend to believe it, you should reflect on whether or not you should give your trust to a meta-analysis. I recall a professor at the University of Washington who would say, changing the lies, damn lies, and statistics to there are lies, damn lies, and meta-analyses. And by that he meant it was very possible for a meta-analysis to mislead, and the only way that you can safely give your trust to a meta-analysis is to look at the details yourself, is to do some work yourself, and we're going to do that together. More than 80% of the patients in this meta-analysis came from just 4 trials. They're highlighted here, and we're going to start with those. The CARDS study, the Collaborative Atorvastatin Diabetes Study, almost 3,000 patients, atorvastatin versus placebo, stopped early due to a 36% relative risk reduction in cardiac events. They came to very strong conclusions. They studied patients with type 2 diabetes with reasonable LDL levels, but with a risk factor, retinopathy, albuminuria, smoking, or hypertension. Their conclusions were that there was no justification for using a threshold of LDL as the arbitrator by which to decide to treat diabetics, and that the debate now really was whether or not any diabetic was at sufficiently low risk for a statin to be withheld. And they claimed no excessive adverse events. This study gets the red flashing light. Pfizer had a financial stake in the outcome. Data collection, data entry was done by staff at Pfizer, and the study was terminated early based on a composite endpoint, not mortality. The endpoint was a composite. It troubled me that their discussion of their composite endpoint included this statement: sudden death ascribable to coronary heart disease, but for which acute myocardial infarction could not be confirmed, were classified as acute coronary heart disease deaths. In other words, sudden death for whom they could not prove was due to coronary heart disease were classified as being due to coronary heart disease. We also already have noted that there is an error rate in this determination. This may be a small matter, but it troubled me. Again, there was no significant difference in all-cause mortality. I think this table casts doubt on the trustworthiness of this study. They do not present this table in the article because I think it raises questions immediately upon looking at it. I went through the text of the article, picked out all the numbers having to do with adverse events, and put them in this table so we could look at them. In this study, placebo did worse than atorvastatin in all adverse events described. More placebo patients had serious adverse events. More discontinued their drug due to adverse events. But most unbelievable of all are the last 3. Statins are known to cause muscle side effects, muscle adverse events. But here, placebo patients suffered more muscle pain. 5 times as many placebo patients had significant rises in the muscle enzyme creatine kinase, and more placebo patients discontinued their drug due to muscle adverse events. This is simply not believable. Now, does it trouble you that this study, which was published in 2004, includes this statement about a CTT meta-analysis that is not yet published? meta-analysis from the cholesterol treatment trials collaboration will include CARDS data and will be important in showing unequivocally the safety of achieving very low concentrations of LDL. How do they know that? Upon publication of the CARD study, how do they know that it will be included in a meta-analysis that's not yet done? And how do they know that the conclusion will be showing unequivocally the safety of achieving low concentrations of LDL? It's impossible to know that at the time this article was published. Now, if you take all of these together, does this article present an objective presentation of data or a promotion for the use of statins? Is it science or is it advocacy? No justification is available for using a threshold. All patients with type 2 diabetics should receive a statin. The debate is whether or not anyone is at low enough risk for treatment to be withheld, and this surprising statement about a meta-analysis not yet done. We know this was a pharma-sponsored study, but given the clear promotional nature of the text of the article, one wonders if this were ghost-written, written by the pharmaceutical industry to be signed off by the investigators, and given the positive statements about its inclusion in the CTT8, was it done with the intent to be used in the CTT8? Let's go on to the heart protection study. The full study had over 20,000 patients, about 6,000 of whom had diabetes. These patients were aged 40 to 80, had vascular disease or diabetes, simvastatin or placebo. The full study was published in 2002, and the diabetics were taken out and reported on again separately in 2003. We see the CTSU again. The trial was run by the CTSU. It was funded by Merck. The relative risk is emphasized over the absolute risk, but they claim a 1.5% absolute risk of coronary mortality in patients with diabetes. Any reduction in mortality should be looked at closely. The problem here is that this reduction of mortality was for the diabetics, half of whom had known vascular disease, and that is not the question we're interested in. Do statins provide a benefit for diabetics without known vascular disease? And they don't present their data in a way that you can determine this, so they do not answer the question for our patient. Will she benefit from a statin? She doesn't have vascular disease. Is the full benefit here for those with vascular disease? The ASCOT study, the Anglo-Scandinavian Cardiac Outcomes Trial, was a study of more than 10,000 men and women, 2,500 with diabetes. Once again, vascular disease or diabetes, this time randomized to atorvastatin or placebo, stopped early due to a reduction in a composite endpoint. The diabetics were reported on 2 years later. Once again, 2,500 plus patients with diabetes. Now, here are some red flags of interest. There was no benefit for women, and yet the results are extrapolated to men and women. For the primary endpoint, which was non-fatal MI and cardiac death, in the full study, the benefit was not significant in 6 subgroups, including patients with diabetes. So in the full study, with the endpoint as designed, there was no benefit for diabetes. But when this same group of diabetic patients was reported on separately 2 years later, significant benefit was found. How did they do that? They changed the endpoint. The endpoint now included revascularization procedures, arrhythmias, peripheral vascular disease, congestive heart failure, angina. This one, I think, deserves the red flashing light. Pfizer has a financial stake in the outcome. The study was terminated early based on a soft endpoint, not the hard endpoint of mortality. They don't state clearly whether or not the study sponsor controlled the data prior to providing it to the study statisticians, but I would be very surprised if they didn't. Another red flag here is the very first sentence in the diabetic arm, in the publication of the diabetics by themselves, the very first sentence in the abstract: this study aims to establish the benefits of lowering cholesterol in diabetic patients. So they're not saying that the study aims to evaluate the benefits of lowering cholesterol in diabetic patients, but the study aims to establish the benefits of lowering cholesterol in diabetic patients. And how did they do that? They changed the endpoint. Once again, they changed the rules of the game after the game was completed. The ALLHAT study, more than 10,000 participants, 3,600 with diabetes. This study has an important difference from all of the other studies cited by our alerts to have our patients be placed on a statin. This study was not sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry. It was sponsored by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, pravastatin versus placebo, and they found no benefit from a statin, no change in mortality or vascular events. So not sponsored by the pharmaceutical company, not stopped early, no benefit for statins. Now, why are these 6 studies included in a meta-analysis used to justify treatment of diabetics without heart disease with statins? These 6 studies are exclusively for those with known coronary vascular disease. These patients all had angina or a previous MI or a revascularization procedure. So why were 6 studies for patients with vascular disease placed in the meta-analysis used to justify treatment of diabetics without vascular disease? And why is the PROSPER study included? This was of the elderly, almost 6,000 men and women, 600 plus with diabetes. And these patients, not only were they elderly, but they had a history of vascular disease or a history of significant risk factors for vascular disease. There was no change in overall mortality. There was a decrease in MI mortality, but there was a statistically significant increased cancer mortality in the elderly given a statin. So many patients with vascular disease, no change in mortality. Why is this meta-analysis including a study of the elderly with vascular disease to justify treatment of diabetics without vascular disease? The ALERT study, why was this one included? These were renal transplant patients, and the risk reduction was not significant. The Air Force study, why was this one included with only 155 patients with diabetes, and a study like the ASPEN study with 2,400 patients not included? There was no difference in mortality. They noted a relative risk reduction in a composite endpoint. The study sponsor clearly had a financial stake in the outcome, and the study was terminated early based on a composite. And the employees of Merck were thanked in the fine print at the end of the article for managing the data. It's confusing that in the text of the article, they refer to the Spectrum Pharmaceutical Research Corp as being contracted to manage the data. But this research corp did not file as a foreign for-profit corporation in the state of Texas till 1997, and this study began in 1990. So I'm not certain why the Spectrum Pharmaceutical Research Corp is referred to as managing the data. Red flags. 3 of the 10 authors were employees of Merck, and 2 were consultants to Merck. Again, composite endpoint, no difference in mortality, only 155 patients with diabetes. In the West of Scotland study, this one had only 76 patients with diabetes. Again, why was this one included when a larger study like the ASPEN study not included? They noted a relative risk reduction in coronary events, but not a difference in mortality. Here, the lead investigator receives consulting fees from GlaxoSmithKline, Merck, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca, and lecture fees from AstraZeneca and Merck. The CTT did not include several studies on the use of statins in diabetes. And so what is the quality of a meta-analysis on the use of statins in diabetes that ignores two major studies done specifically in this population and other studies with significant numbers of diabetic patients? We've talked about the Aspen study with 2,400 patients not included, the German 4D study with 1,200 patients not included, and other studies with significant numbers of diabetics not included. So the choice of studies to be included in this meta-analysis is more than highly questionable. Who is the CTT? What is the CTT? Who are they? The CTT was established in 1994 after it was identified that no single ongoing trial would have sufficient statistical power to address key uncertainties, and it was planned to conduct periodic meta-analyses. Now, on the surface, this is very reasonable. Reasonable goal to address key uncertainties, but one needs to recall the admonition of the professor who would say lies, damn lies, in meta-analyses. One needs to look closely at details before lending one's trust to the meta-analysis. The CTT itself has red flags. The CTT is a study group within the Medical Research Council. In England, the Secretary of State for Business appoints the members of the Medical Research Council. The Medical Research Council has a number of units, one of which is at Oxford, which contains the CTSU, the Clinical Trial Service Unit, which contains the CTT collaboration. So we have the Secretary of State for Business, the MRC, the CTSU, and the CTT. The current membership of the MRC includes those with direct ties to the pharmaceutical industry. And if one searches the MRC and GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca, and these are the two major pharmaceutical companies in England, if we research the MRC and GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca and look for their ties, we find very close ties. If you Google MRC and GSK, Medical Research Council, GlaxoSmithKline, you'll have over 200,000 results and clear statements of collaboration between the MRC and the pharmaceutical industry. And if we do a search for the MRC and AstraZeneca, once again we find over 200,000 results and clear collaboration between the two. Further red flags for the CTT: it denies access to the databases. Their databases are not open to outside reviewers who want to study the specifics of the meta-analyses done by the CTT. It is not available publicly. Why not? I think this is damning. This is a current listing from the meetings of the CTT. At least this was taken from the fine print at the end of the publication on the CTT 2008 meta-analysis. The collaborating trialists are investigators in pharmaceutical company-sponsored trials. So we have investigators dependent on the pharmaceutical industry for funding. Listed as observers to their deliberations are all the major manufacturers of statins. So we have trialists dependent on the pharmaceutical industry being observed by the pharmaceutical industry. How can anyone assert that this would be conducive to an unbiased meta-analysis? I apologize for the blurriness here, but these are evidence-based statements having to do with diabetics without heart disease. These are from our current American Heart Association guideline from page 65. And for two groups of diabetics without heart disease, the justification is solely the CTT 2008. And we've reviewed this meta-analysis. And the sole justification for the third group is the CARDS data. This is a study within the CTT 2008 in which 5 times as many placebo patients had significant rises in creatine kinase over the statin. This is the sum total of the evidence to promote the idea that our patient should be placed on a statin. Now, more than a third of all American Heart Association guideline evidence statements are supported only by a CTT meta-analysis. How is this going unchallenged by academic medicine? Once again, trialists dependent on the pharmaceutical industry, observed by the pharmaceutical industry to come to a guideline. Back to our patient. Do you encourage her to take a statin? Do you find the evidence we've reviewed of sufficient quality to state that she needs a statin? Should all adult diabetics take statins? Now, if you find that the data is dubious as to whether or not the statin is going to provide an important benefit, adverse effects are of great concern. Let's remind ourselves how statins work. They block HMG-CoA. They block the mevalonic acid pathway, which is a primary pathway to subsequent metabolic pathways. And just at a glance, you can see there's certainly the potential here for adverse effects given the number of metabolic pathways blocked. One of the pathways blocked is the pathway to nuclear factor kappa B, and this is important in our inflammatory response. And there are those who feel that the benefit that statins give to those with vascular disease, those with a previous MI, is due to this anti-inflammatory effect and has nothing to do with cholesterol. Statins do block the production of cholesterol, and they also block the production of CoQ10, which is important in the energy production in our cells. Let's begin with a basic question. If we give our patient a statin, does it help her disease or worsen her disease? Statins increase the risk of diabetes and increase the risk of impaired glycemic control, of worsening control in patients who already have diabetes. So they're not going to help our patient control the basic disease. In this study, the metabolic syndrome in men study, clearly an increased risk for those on statins of developing type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. Now, this is from a meta-analysis of the development of diabetes and trials of statins, and they concluded that there was a statistically significant increased risk of developing diabetes when patients are placed on a statin. It's interesting to see that the most significant increase was in the PROSPER group, and these were of the elderly, who one could consider to be metabolically more fragile, and in the JUPITER trial, and these were women 60 plus and men 50 plus with elevated CRPs, and one can also imagine that this group would be more metabolically at risk. This is the article from which that table is taken. 13 studies, more than 91,000 patients. Now, diabetics have increased risk for a number of medical problems. They have an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, for dementia. They have an increased risk of sexual dysfunction, neuropathy, fatigue, and cataracts. Do statins help avoid any of these problems diabetics are prone to? Statins help diabetics prevent declines in mental acuity. Matthew Muldoon is a professor of medicine at Pittsburgh, and he did 2 studies in which he gave neuropsychological tests to a group of subjects, placed half of them on a statin and half on placebo, and at 6 months repeated the tests. The first study involved lovastatin, and he found that the statin group did worse in all measures on repeat testing. In this table, in this graph, the empty bars, the white bars, are the placebo patients, and the shaded bars are the lovastatin patients. In attention and mental speed and flexibility, the placebo group improved from first to second testing, and the statin group declined. And overall, the placebo group did better than the statin group in all measures. He did a similar study this time using simvastatin and a different set of neuropsychological tests, but he came to the same conclusion, that statins affect the patient's ability to benefit from prior experience. And if you look at adverse event reporting, you can find cases of total global amnesia, TGA, memory impairment, confusional state disorientation, and dementia. This study showed that statins are strongly associated with acute memory loss. These studies showed that higher cholesterol levels late in life were associated with decreased dementia risk. So do we really want to be trying to reduce cholesterol levels in the elderly? So do statins help prevent declines in mental acuity? I think the answer is clearly they do not. Do statins help diabetics prevent erectile dysfunction? This study, a small study, showed that 22% of men in a cardiovascular clinic after 6 months of statin therapy had new onset erectile dysfunction. This study showed significant drop in testosterone level in men given a statin, and this was confirmed in this study. It's not difficult to imagine why this might be the case. Cholesterol is a precursor to our sex hormones. It is a precursor to estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, adrenocorticosteroid hormone, and to vitamin D. So when we block our cholesterol production, we may be blocking our sex hormone production. Do statins help diabetics prevent erectile dysfunction? I think the answer here, once again, is clearly no. Do statins help diabetics prevent neuropathy? This study showed that statin users had significantly more cases of neuropathy over controls. Neuropathy was also significantly higher in statin users in this study. So do statins help diabetics prevent neuropathy? Once again, the answer is no. Do statins help prevent fatigue? This study showed that statin users had decreased energy and increased fatigue with mild exertion. Now, why might this occur? Might it have something to do with CoQ10 that we mentioned earlier as one of the pathways blocked by statins? This is the Krebs cycle. You really don't have to pay too much attention to it. I want you to note the red boxes on the outside, the NADH. This is a pathway in which glucose and ketones are metabolized and energy is produced. But the majority of the energy of the body comes from the electron transport chain. The chain begins with NADH and ends with energy. And CoQ10 is needed for 2 of the 5 steps of this process. CoQ10 is also an important antioxidant for the oxidants inevitably produced in energy production. So when we block CoQ10, as statins do, we are blocking the electron transport chain, 2 steps of the electron transport chain. So we are blocking the production of energy, and we are interfering with the neutralization of the oxidants produced. And this is not precisely analogous, but if one considers congestive heart failure to be the ultimate in fatigue of the heart muscle, patients admitted with congestive heart failure, if their CoQ10 levels were low, this was predictive of mortality. Do statins help prevent fatigue? Once again, the answer here is clearly no. Is this due to decreased CoQ10 levels? Perhaps. Is it due to impaired adrenocorticosteroid hormone production? Perhaps. Is it due to a combination of things or something else? Perhaps. How about this? Do statins help diabetics reduce the risk for cataracts? Statins and diabetes are independent risks for cataracts, so statins do not help here either. Do statins help diabetics reduce the risk for cancer? This is certainly a more controversial question. Diabetics do have increased risk for cancer. Diabetics have increased risk in breast cancer. And the best study done to date, this does not constitute proof, but the best study done to date was done at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. And they did a study of long-term statin users, for women who had used statins for 10 or more years. And for those women, they found an almost doubling of the risk for breast cancer. And if we combine that with the concerning results in the PROSPER study, which found an increased cancer mortality in the elderly given statins, and we combine that with a CARE study, and this was a study of statin use in women who had had previous myocardial infarction. And at the end of the CARE study, it was 1 breast cancer found in the placebo group and 12 in the pravastatin group. So none of these studies constitute proof by any means, but they do raise concern. Remember, the cholesterol treatment trialists, the CTT, plans to perform meta-analyses to address key uncertainties. So they address this one, and this is their meta-analysis of 2012, and they concluded that at a median of 5 years of statin therapy, there was no effect on the incidence of or mortality from any type of cancer. A couple of comments on this. One, the median of 5 years of statin therapy may not have been long enough. The Fred Hutchinson study involved women with 10 plus years of statins, so this study may not have been long enough to see that effect. And we have all of the concerns we've already discussed about the makeup of the cholesterol treatment trialists. So are you reassured by this meta-analysis? The 2013 American Heart Association guideline is an intimidating document. It is 84 pages long. It includes discussion of levels of evidence, critical questions, and there are 80 evidence-based statements with the whole alphabet soup of acronyms of cholesterol studies to justify each of those evidence-based statements. So it is a very intimidating document. But as I went through the details of this guideline and looked at the studies that we've discussed here, this phrase forced itself into my mind. If you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bull. Perhaps this was unfair of me to have this thought, but this was almost involuntary, or it was involuntary in its awareness. It's coming to my awareness as I went through these very poorly done studies. And this is a fairly well-known quote. This is from a former associate director of the Framingham Project. The public is being deceived by the greatest health scam of the century. Troubling thought. And that's the end of this presentation. I thank you very much for your attention, and I will leave you with our patient. How strongly are you going to encourage her to take a statin? And can you justify your decision? Once again, thank you.